Sam Seder. On the Majority Report, Emma Vigeland is out today. I want to welcome back to the program Osita Nwanevu, contributing editor at New Republic and columnist at The Guardian, and author of his first book, and much anticipated around here, I have to say, Right of the People, Democracy in the Case for a New American Founding. Osita, congratulations on the book. I have to say that it's incredibly timely, and I think for me personally, when I did this big Jubilee surrounded debate, it had not occurred to me that I would have to justify things like why xenophobia is bad, why a theocracy is not good, where the things that we have taken for granted by simply saying we want a democracy, we really can't take for granted anymore. And your book really fundamentally addresses that that issue. Where were you in the course of this? I mean, I know this is a book that you've been writing for a while, but where were you in the course of thinking that like the notion of democracy itself needs to be justified?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been working on this book since 2021. I've been covering American politics for about 9-10 years now. And as I was sort of gathering ideas for, a first book, it occurred to me that in my time writing about politics, democracy was kind of a central concept. Obviously, Trump wins in 2016 with an electoral college victory rather than a popular vote victory. Second time in 25 years that's happened. I remember being in second grade when Bush won the same way and sort of internalizing that basic sense of unfairness and carrying it with me. But even beyond that, and beyond the things that followed the 2016 election, the effort to overturn the 2020 election, the attempted coup, as I was covering the Democratic primary in 2020, I found myself having to write over and over and over again. Well, even if Democrats win, probably not going to pass Medicare for all, probably not going to pass a Green New Deal, probably not going to pass immigration reform for like structural reasons, that there were these structural obstacles to getting a lot of that agenda passed that had to be dealt with. And I got tired of writing that without interrogating the system behind it. Like, why is it the case we have a system that's set up this way? When Republicans say, in response to some of these arguments, well, we're not supposed to be a democracy in the first place, we're a republic. What's the kind of philosophical response you can make to that? How do you maybe persuade people who are persuaded by that argument that that's actually wrong? So all of this was kind of in the air as I thought about, what would be worth writing about. And I think that the results of November kind of vindicate that choice. I mean, Democrats ran pretty hard on a pro-democracy message. I don't think you could have escaped that unless you were living under a rock. I think voters heard that message and they were like, actually, as much as we might like democracy conceptually, we actually think that Donald Trump's going to be better on the price of groceries, on rent, on my basic material needs. And so there's this fundamental challenge here where, as you say, like people aren't taking the centrality of democracy for granted. People don't take it for granted that we have a democracy in the first place that's worth saving and so on. And so this is I think an ideal time to sort of go back to first principles. What does this word actually mean? What does it commit us to? Is the system that we have now democratic? And if it's not, what actually gets us there? And what actually brings most of the American people along with us on the project of democratic reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the need. I remember Ben Rhodes writing an op-ed of all people in the wake of the election, saying, you're going around talking about saving democracy, and all what a lot of people are hearing is the system that has been screwing us, and so there's sort of like there's a two-part challenge which you address in the book, which is one, arguing why democracy is, I guess, the least worst of our options, essentially, as you quote Churchill, and two, how we can make our democracy actually work. Let's go through. I just want to go through like the three elements that you talk about that are pillars of democracy: agency, dynamism, and procedure. Walk us through those briefly.
Sure. So these are like three brass tacks reasons why we should prefer democracy to some kind of ruled by the few, whether that's a king or an oligarch, whatever. So agency is the principle that we have the power ourselves as the governed to determine what our problems are and how to solve them. We're not waiting for some external entity to say, this is wrong, this is messed up, I feel like fixing it. We ourselves, the people who are subject to governance, have the ability to do that on our own. That's important and powerful. The second thing is dynamism. So democracy has all of these kind of inbuilt features that allow for change to happen. There are inbuilt times where you canvass the public, you evaluate how policies are doing, you evaluate how particular policymakers are doing, and you have systems by which you can replace those people. You don't really get that as a structural feature of rule by the few or rule by a single person. And the last thing is procedure. Democracy offers us ways to change things stably and peacefully in an ideal world in the abstract. You're not having to overthrow somebody every time you want something to get done. You're not having to go out and fight people in the streets. You have a system, a process through which people can collectively make change together in stable and predictable kinds of ways. These are, I think, core practical reasons why democracy, I think, succeeds as a system of governance beyond the alternatives. But also talk, too, about this kind of background ideal, which I find in some ways even more compelling than the kind of nuts and bolts technical arguments, which is democracy proceeds from the principle that we are all entitled to a basic level of control and agency over the conditions that shape our lives. We're not just helplessly victims of circumstance and the things that happen to us. We're not enthralled to people who happen to be richer or more powerful or in some other part of a hierarchy that we're born into. We ourselves, each and every one of us, has some capacity to exercise a level of agency over what's going on in our lives and an ability to direct our lives. That is, I think, a very, very powerful, compelling intuition. And I think it's one that radicalizes, or at least broadens our conception of what democracy ought to be, as I also talk about in this book. So if you take that principle seriously, it becomes very easy to say then, well, obviously we're entitled to more than just a ballot every couple of years in Washington. We're also governed in many important ways at work. We're governed in the economy. The decisions that are made at the top of corporations that we work for often affect us more intimately, immediately, and directly than decisions being made by politicians. And so there's also a level of democratic agency that I think we're entitled to in the economy. But yeah, these are sort of the broad strokes, reasons why democracy is compelling. And the other thing I should say here too, is that the basic, most simple definition of democracy, beyond reasons why it's good, the definition that I think I find most compelling is a system in which the governed themselves govern, or as Lincoln put, government of, by, and for the people. You can read a lot of dusty, abstract books with a lot of formulas to get you, through working through what democracy is all about. But I think that's the core kernel of the idea.
And it seems to me too. I mean, that it defines goals, democracy, when it's working. And we put an asterisk on all this because you address the failures of of our democracy, and we'll get into that in a moment. But when it's working, it defines the goals and thereby sort of like and if the democracy is working, it increases the competency to reach those goals. I mean, I guess, the biggest illustration of this that I've used over the years is the Gates Foundation and their work in education. They, a billionaire has the ability to come in, dump several $1 billion into a system, completely reshape the way that we do education. And then 10 years later, they hire the Rand Corporation to do a report on it. And the report says, yeah, we screwed up. We should just listen to educators. Meanwhile, we have a multi-decade sort of experiment that has fundamentally changed our education system, and we've got to recover from it. All this value-added teaching and high-stakes testing, and the lack of competency in that project is a function of the procedure in which the goals were set. Because they were wrong in their entire estimation, and because they didn't have educators, essentially all the stakeholders involved in setting what the attempt to so-called reform education is, and our government works in a similar fashion.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And sometimes, and I have a whole chapter where I talk about critics of democracy, criticisms of democracy that I think are worth addressing. In a lot of that rhetoric, you'll often get the idea that, well, people are stupid. And so what we should do instead is have a system where we get the smartest people in the world to make all the decisions for us because they know better, I think that's kind of what wealthy people especially would prefer. They're obviously, in their own estimation, the smartest people, so they should be part of the process. But, so there was a test that I referenced in the book where Philip Tetlock, this researcher in the 2000s, gathered a bunch of experts and had them try to make predictions about certain outcomes in the future, gathered dozens or hundreds of these predictions and found that they were actually no better at guessing than if they'd chosen randomly. That's not a knock on the concept of expertise or that expertise is important, but there's something, I think, delusional about saying that by restricting the number of people who are party to a process, restricting access to a process, that intrinsically gives you more sensible, more just, more logical governance, whether that's talking about a nonprofit or whether they're talking about government. Some researchers that I've mentioned in the book think there's actually something special about large groups of people coming together and the collective intelligence of that process coming through rather than restricting choices to a few people. You have different perspectives come into play that wouldn't otherwise be in the room. People can, contribute different bits of knowledge to the process. But I think that people who advocate for democracy are always running up against that fundamental distrust in the public and fundamental distrust in distributed decision-making. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to fight now, not just from the right, but from a lot of, I think, technocratic centrists.
And let's talk about, you tackle how democracy works when it works. There were three major characteristics you outlined: equality, responsiveness, and majoritarianism. I mean, it brings in stark relief where our deficits are in terms of a democracy. Talk briefly about those three elements. And I think for a lot of people, it's somewhat self-evident where we're lacking in those.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are three principles I think end up being commonsensical when you describe them to people. Equality, in a democratic system, every party to a collective choice has to be an equal kind of standing. If you leave the door open to some other kind of arrangement, some people have more rights than others, some people whose votes count more than others, that leaves open the possibility of, well, there's some smaller class of people that's governing. It's not the collective as a whole, it's some subset that has more privileges, more rights. So we need equality. Responsiveness, democracy is not a suggestion box. When the people come together to make a decision, to make a choice, that means something. They act with some kind of authority. And the system is obligated to respond in some kind of way. And the last thing, majoritarianism. Of all the different ways in which people can make a choice collectively, from unanimous agreement all the way through, some form of minority rule. Majority rule is the only principle that's consistent with equality. So if two people want something, three people want some other thing, there's no way that the two get their way over the three unless there's some kind of inequality involved in the process. You need majoritarianism, I think, for any of this to really make sense. Again, they all sound like commonsensical principles, but immediately you start analyzing the system we have, and it's obvious that we flout that in some fundamental ways. So I've done a number of these talks already in DC, and I always make a point of saying, look, we are sitting right now in a city of about 700,000 people that does not have a full and equal say in governance, in the federal government, the government. They have a non-voting delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who cannot vote in the final passage of legislation. There are 4 million Americans for whom that is true. So under not only that schema that I outlined, but I think any reasonable conception of democracy, those people are not living in a democratic society. They're governed by a federal government they don't have a full and equal voice in. Beyond that, even for those of us who do have representation, that representation is very unequally apportioned. A resident of Wyoming, on the basis of population, has about 67 times representation as somebody who lives in California. California would be, if it were its own country, one of the 40 largest countries in the world, one of the largest economies in the world, has the same number of seats in the Senate as Wyoming, a city with fewer people, in fact, than Washington, D.C. does. That doesn't make any sense democratically speaking. You learn in grade school that the House balances this out. It's not true in any meaningful way. The Senate alone decides on judicial appointments, it decides on executive appointments. Obviously, you need both houses to pass any kind of ordinary legislation. So those inequities really, really matter, and I think have contributed to so much of the dysfunction that we see in our system and in our politics. So
and those are by design. I mean, we're just at the by design sort of I guess silo of failures of how a democracy is supposed to work. Before we even get into how much of these things have also been corrupted by money or the machinations within those structures.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I do spend some time talking about money and politics. I do think we should do something about Citizens United and campaign finance and lobbying and all these things we talk about all the time. But below that and beyond that, we have a lot of deep structural inequities in the system that are actually only going to get worse. Population dynamics are going to make the inequities in the Senate worse over time. And given all the problems we face as a country, whether it's climate change or immigration, whatever it is that we want to collectively solve in a reasonable way, the design of the system has been a real barrier to getting things done. And it's time for us to confront that, especially given, I think it's fair to say, the fact that Donald Trump is sitting here as president today, largely as a function of the system's inequities. Now, he won the popular vote in 2024. I don't deny that or dismiss that. But he came into the 2024 election as a former president, which is a pretty nifty thing to be as a presidential candidate. And he's a former president because he won the 2016 election by electoral college victory. He's sustained in office during 2 impeachment attempts in which senators representing majorities of the country, I think over 50% the first time, over 60% the second time, voting to remove him from office. The threshold was so high it didn't matter. So Donald Trump has been sustained by these features of the system. And the fact that he seems like he's been invulnerable to them, I think is part of what's attracted so many people to his candidacy and to him as a political figure. This is a guy who you can't tame, who can't be touched, and has this kind of power. And that's one more reason that I should consider voting for him, because he's going to use that power to my advantage. These are impressions that were created by the framework that we've been handed down. And if we are against authoritarianism, we should be taking a look at not just Donald Trump's own personal conduct, not even just the Republican Party's insanity, but the ways in which the system has allowed him to come to power and has continued pulling the party, from my perspective, to the right.
And I don't want to go back too much here, but that's what I find so important about your book is that, it's not hard. You don't have to do too much digging to find J.D. Vance. I mean, Donald Trump, I don't know that has done much thinking about this, but you don't have to dig too far to find J.D. Vance and a lot of the people who are involved in the Trump administration and ideology that says democracy is not the least worst of bad options, but that I'm thinking, but is in fact inferior to a benevolent leader, whether it's sort of like Peter Thiel or Curtis Yarvin or J.D. Vance and all of the minions or Andreessen. I mean, those are just the people who have said it more publicly because they're, I guess, maybe less concerned about being tagged in this way. But this argument that authoritarianism is actually good. We could get a benevolent leader, I guess, presumably. And this minoritarianism has sort of ushered that era in, which is also why it's important to talk about these critiques. But let's also talk about what you deal with in the second half of the book, which is a new founding. We've talked on this program many, many times about the Reconstruction as really the founding of the America we live in today, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in particular as the, how they have reshaped our society, and continue. I think, the vast majority of Supreme Court cases, constitutional cases, deal with the 14th Amendment in some fashion or another. Talk about the what we need to do politically to fix our democracy in the timeline, because and undergirding this, of course, we have to fight the authoritarianism now without any sort of powers or I should say levers of power within the system, as opposed to sort of fighting authoritarianism with just people power and et cetera. But what do you see as the sort of timeline for political power? Because there have been movements to amend the Constitution, but sequentially, you don't want to do that too early because you need to be ready.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really good question. It's one that I wrestle with, especially towards the end of the book. I think that there are shorter term goals and longer term goals. There are things that we can do in the next couple of years if Democrats take Washington again, to democratize the system and bring things further in line with our aspirations here. So the For the People Act, John Lewis Voting Rights Act that came up early in the Biden administration, those things should be revived. So they would have made it easier to vote. They would have protected voting rights in all kinds of ways, dealt with gerrymandering, which is now obviously a conversation again, as it is reliably after every census. So those kinds of legislative fixes, I think, are well within reach. More ambitious things that Democrats didn't consider, like adding new state, provided the states and the territories in question want to become states, should be on the table. Adding justices to the Supreme Court to bring that in balance with political outcomes and maybe leading towards some kind of nonpartisan reform later on, that should be pursued. So there are things like that ought to be done and could be done as a matter of political will in the next few years. But the longer term horizon, where I'm talking about things like dealing with the Senate, getting rid of the Senate or fundamentally changing it someday, that's going to take a bit of time. And I think that takes really the cultivation and building of a political movement for democracy that doesn't really exist yet. People feel anxious about Donald Trump. They feel anxious about democracy maybe in the abstract. But when it comes to these kind of structural reforms, I think it's mostly an academic conversation, mostly a conversation that liberal law professors have been driving. I think there needs to be a built need amongst the American public, or felt need amongst the American public, that if we don't resolve these structural inequities, we're actually going to be far from improving the policymaking process and improving their lives in the way that we'd expect a democratic system to. There needs to be fundamental changes in order to make Washington work better in the long run. And I think the way to do that, and my ideas here are very kind of loose, but convincing people that this is more than just an abstract struggle, and these are more than abstract challenges, that when the Senate functions as it does, the way the Electoral College functions the way that it does, that means that it's harder for us to deliver more rights to workers, deliver people health care. It's harder for us to deliver childcare. All of these policy items that we want to accomplish, we don't get them in a world where the system is inequitably set up in the way that it's been. That has to be kind of the leading edge of the argument. It can't just be, a bunch of professors came here and said that the Senate is malapportioned by this by this number. It has to be really, really felt. And I think the way you get people to feel that too is, again, appealing to this background idea. Do we ourselves have a measure of agency over a society, or are we in a society that's run by Elon Musk and billionaires? Right? Do we, as the ordinary American people, have some capacity to create the country that we want, or is that going to be left to people who are already wealthy and already powerful? That's the fundamental question, and I think that broadens our sense of crisis. Like, even when Donald Trump goes, and even if Democrats come in to government next time around, we will still be living in a society that is deeply economically unequal in a way that's going to undermine and threaten democracy. Elon Musk is a perfect example of this. Wealthiest man in the world, donates $260 million to a campaign, is awarded with a post in government where he does whatever he wants and reworks the executive branch, right? We're on the way to having our first trillionaires in this country. we can leave this point of immediate crisis and find ourselves in a world where democracy or the democratic ideal is still fundamentally threatened. And people need to feel that in order to believe in the need for deep reform.
Where, where are we in the course of, or where should we be, or what do you perceive where we should be in the sort of, I guess, rhetorical sequencing? Because I mean, to say obviously to say we need to save democracy, insufficient. And I know you believe that we need to pair this with sort of the material deprivations or benefits that we could get, depending on how you look at it, with a functioning democracy. And where down the line, I guess, on the sort of like hierarchy of how broad those questions are. I mean, I know, I don't know, I can't remember if you identify as a democratic socialist or not, but where we should be as rhetorically at this point, both from like a, sort of just an electoral standpoint and what kind of candidates we should be having. Is it enough, I guess, to sort of say like we're going to get rid of the authoritarian without talking about the reasons why and how sort of material those reasons are?
Yeah, I mean, what I always say is that I'm for democracy in the broadest meaning and sense of that word. And so if we believe in democracy, again, that means that we're not just entitled to the vote and need to protect the vote, but it matters to us that an Amazon worker or a Walmart worker or a McDonald's worker can, on the one hand, vote, and I think this is right, on the basis of what they think our foreign policy should be with respect to Russia or Iran, but has no place in their life where they can say, this is how I think Amazon should be run. This is how I think Walmart should be run. This is how I think McDonald's should be run. That's a fundamental inequity and a democratic problem. How can it be that in the places where we are governed more intimately, immediately, and directly often than decisions that are made in Washington, D.C., how can it be in the places where we spend a third of our lives and drive our livelihoods, we have no agency and no say over our working lives? That is a democratic challenge. And so I think what we say is, look, we believe in not just saving democracy, protecting democracy. The project here is to create, for the first time, American democracy. This is a constructive project, a founding, in which we will not only have a democratic political system, but we'll also move towards a democratic economy. And in that way, really instantiate and create a society that is truly governed by ordinary people. That's the message, that's the vision. It's a way of talking about democracy that's not just the defense of institutions, at this time when so many Americans distrust institutions. It's saying, there is a place we want to go as a society. There is a vision driving and animating us of what a more democratic society looks like, of what a more just society would look like, and we are going to go there by instituting both political and economic reforms to empower us and to wrest power back from the millionaires and the billionaires and the executives and the investors on Wall Street, who don't have the right, by virtue of their wealth, by virtue of the position in the economy, to lord over us, both in the economy and in politics.
And you talk specifically about Sanders' proposal to develop structures that are more democratic within the workplace. Just briefly, just outline that for folks, because I don't think it gets much attention.
No, it doesn't. And I think it's wild because this was one of, I think, the most ambitious policy proposals any presidential candidate has made in the history of this country. It got very little attention in 2020. So Sanders' idea, derived from the Labor Party, was that companies of a certain size, more than $100 million in revenue or in their balance sheet, or if they're just publicly traded at all, would be required over time to contribute about 20% of their shares to a fund that would be owned and controlled by their own workers, right? So if you were a worker at Amazon, there would be a fund at Amazon where 20% of Amazon's shares go that would pay you as a worker a dividend and also give you voting rights over the decisions at Amazon, right? So it's 20%, it's not the majority, but this would still be a remarkable amount of power relative to now, given to the workers at major corporations in this country. It'd be a way to embed democracy within these corporate structures. And there are all kinds of reforms I talk about in this vein towards the end of the book, because again, I don't think that we can cleave apart the political and the economic sphere here, both as a matter of principle and as a practical reality. If inequality persists in the economy in the way that it's been, that corrodes and corrupts and prevents Washington from functioning the way that it ought to, prevents our cities and communities and states from functioning the way that they ought to, because they're dominated by the wealth that people are extracting from the economy. There has to be some kind of interwovenness here. And I think that one of the reasons why our democratic reform efforts on the political side have not succeeded is because we haven't taken the economic component seriously. You cannot do campaign finance reform. You cannot do lobbying reform, or at least it's going to be very, very hard, if the economy is dominated by people who then use their wealth to influence the political process and prevent you from enacting those reforms. The other way that I think they're connected is, and this ought to be, attractive to people who are very, very concerned about tribalism, polarization, all these kinds of things. If democracy is something that we practice not just every couple of years in an election, but on a regular basis at work, we're learning how to engage with other people who might disagree with us, to compromise, to work together, to present your ideas, speak publicly, all of these skills that we don't really use or practice or develop outside elections. If work becomes a venue for those things, that might actually lead to better politics in some way. It's worth trying, at least, developing these skills on a more regular basis in the places where we spend so much of our time. So anyway, I think that there are all kinds of reasons why the economic sphere, the concept of economic democracy, which used to be talked about by the Roosevelts and other folks, why that needs to make a resurgence here at this moment now, because I don't know that the project of political reform succeeds without that.
What is, this seems to be the biggest challenge, it seems to me, is how do you intervene in a system now that is self-perpetuating? Like, we're having this fight in the Democratic Party, obviously, shorthand, Bernie on his oligarchy tour, and then, I don't know, allowing crypto to buy essentially a Wild West market, which is sure to catch up with us at one point. But how do you break the cycle? Like where the party is now sort of captured by we've hit some type of critical mass where the party in the system is captured by these things that have corrupted democracy to the extent that we could even have a functioning one with the structure that we had. The loss of faith in institutions, the increase money in our politics, the exploitation of the weaknesses of the structure of our democracy. What is the method in which we intervene?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to build a public for this. You have to build a movement around these ideas. And, I think that one of the central vehicles for that ought to be the labor movement in particular. I talk about that in the book. I think that unions are an instantiation of economic democracy. You give workers more power, agency at work through a collectively decided upon vehicle. When unions were active in this country, they contributed to the well-being of even non-union members by, contributing to the political efforts behind the Great Society and New Deal. But I think that can also be the vehicles for transforming democratic politics in particular, if we empower them. Again, these are, organizational venues, places where people can come together and participate in politics in new ways, to be newly empowered as workers. So that's why people have been, on the case about unions for a long time. I think we should see that and frame that as a democratic struggle, so that even people who don't necessarily consider themselves on the left, but they're worried about authoritarianism, we say, well, this is also a reason why you should be invested in things like the PRO Act, empowering unions again, because these are vehicles, mechanisms for democracy too. So uniting Democrats who are, again, angry about Donald Trump, angry about authoritarianism, with people with an economic agenda on the left, on democratic grounds, bringing those two sides of the party together, I think would be one way of, electorally making some changes in primaries and within contests. But I think that those constituencies are very cleaved apart. You have people who, are very incensed about Trump, but don't necessarily have an economic agenda. And I think that it's possible to bring those people over closer to our side on the basis of democratic principles. You don't have to call yourself a leftist or a socialist necessarily, but if you believe in democracy, well, that implies certain things about the economy that you should also join in with. That's what I would try as far as the question of how we exert our influence within the Democratic Party is concerned. I think that there is an electoral message that pulls those sides of the party together in ways that left candidates might be able to utilize in primaries moving forward.
I have to say that today, one of the more hopeful things I saw oddly came from James Carville. I don't know how much power he has in the context of the Democratic establishment these days, but he's calling for, more aggressively adding states when Democrats get back into power, the hopes that they do, and expanding the Supreme Court, which I think that like some of these procedural things, structural things will also give momentum and more ability to those people who want to push these more material economic reforms.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you pass a piece of pro-labor legislation now and you haven't put more liberal justices on the Supreme Court, it maybe gets torn apart by this conservative majority, right? So you need to deal with the court for that reason first. I think that there's like a logical priority here where statehood and packing court and democratic reforms of the kind that were in the For the People Act, those happen first and then enable the passage of other parts of the substantive agenda later on. But I think it's important for people to understand, or be told at least by Democrats, because I think it's true, that the reason why these things ought to happen is not just this kind of naked partisan power grab for its own sake, but this is the way to make the system more democratic, and this is the way constructively, or substantively rather, we make it easier for us to pass the policies the American people want and need. If people wake up one day and they see on CNN that Democrats have added justices to the Supreme Court, or they've granted statehood to a bunch of territories, and they don't know why that's happened, and there's no context for it, and they don't have any kind of background reason to support it, I think that they'll fall for a lot of propaganda and a lot of critical arguments from the right and maybe from the center about why this is bad. There needs to be a real compelling message animating support for these policies. So it's good that Carville is saying that this needs to happen, but I think, there needs to be a rhetoric and argument about democracy, what it means, why we don't have one, and why we need one, that the public is hearing and the public believes to move these things forward. Right now, what the public is getting is the Constitution is great, the institutions are great, and Donald Trump's breaking them. And so to switch over and say, we're gonna do all kinds of new, post-institutional or non-institutional stuff, it's gonna hit, I think, the American voter weirdly, unless we've actually built up this argument. And no, actually, the Constitution is not perfect. It was not this thing that was signed and came down on tablets from some mountain. It was a political compromise and so on. Like, if we're not talking about the need for institutional reform, and then we go on and expect our ability to do it when Democrats come to power, I think we're not going to succeed in the way that we ought to.
It's interesting because I feel like the fight that we're seeing in terms of redistricting is a model. Starting to read stories now, the Democrats have reversed themselves in this instance, and it doesn't seem to be sticking too hard. And Republicans trying to argue the hypocrisy is always sort of a fun look for them. But this is sort of like a blueprint for that, right? Where it's sort of like, we're not going to be bound by norms for the sake of, without recognizing that it adds to inequities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be a model. I mean, I think that Democrats who are saying we're just going to do this in kind, I mean, obviously, I think that makes some substantive sense. I don't think I'm hearing enough about why, for an ordinary person who's not plugged into politics, this is a good thing for Democrats to do in response. I think that they need to be told a story here. There needs to be a kind of narrative that gets them to understand, okay, we have this messed up process for redistricting, which we should change, by the way, but we have this messed up process for redistricting. Republicans invested a lot in doing it before. It contributed to the erosion, the destruction of the democratic process. It allowed for people who supported Donald Trump's effort to overturn the election to be elected. And so Democrats now have grounds to redistrict in this particular way now, not just because we like winning for the sake of winning, but because we're going to use these new seats to deliver us a more just democratic system in the future. That I feel like is not I feel like that idea is not in the mix right now as much as it should be. It's just
Gavin
a kind
Newsom's
of
bravado.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and there needs to be a more material foundation for any of this stuff. And I think some of the Democrats have an allergy to that, but hopefully they'll lose it. Osita Nwanevu, the book is The Right of the People: Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding. Really important, very timely book. I certainly feel like I need to brush up on why some of these sort of foundational claims that I have made over the course of 20 years of doing this, things I never thought I'd have to justify and need to be justified now. Really appreciate you coming on and talking about it.
Thanks as always.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.